The polished mahogany of the boardroom table set the stage as Carol Sterling, HOA president turned loan applicant, sat smugly across from the one woman she had underestimated, Bertha. What Carol believed was a simple loan approval was about to become a reckoning years in the making. This is the story of how arrogance, greed, and one reckless act of destruction unraveled in a single, devastating confrontation. Watch until the end. Hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice served, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. After 45 years as a civil engineer, specializing in hydraulics and municipal water systems, Bertha had retired. Her days were no longer filled with blueprints, budget meetings, and the constant, thrumming pressure of ensuring clean water flowed to 1 million homes. Instead, her world had shrunk to the peaceful confines of her property, a 5-acre plot of land her husband Frank had bought decades ago when it was considered out in the sticks. Now, suburbia had encroached, but their little haven remained, anchored by the magnificent koi pond that was Frank's magnum opus and her final joint project with him before he passed. It wasn't just a pond, it was a marvel of engineering and artistry. It held over 100 gallons of water, circulated by a custom-designed filtration system Bertha herself had blueprinted, powerful enough to turn the entire volume over every hour. The water was crystal clear, revealing the smooth grey river stones that lined the bottom. A multi-tiered waterfall, crafted from locally sourced granite, provided a constant, soothing symphony of sound. It was Frank's dream, but it was Bertha's engineering that gave it life, and in it swam the true treasures. Dozens of champion-grade koi, each a living work of art. There was Kintaro, the golden Yamabuki ogon, nearly 3 feet long and worth more than a decent used car. There was Akiko, a snow-white tancho with a single, perfect crimson circle on her head. Bertha knew them all by name. They were her swimming jewels, a legacy of love and a testament to a life built with care. The total investment over the years, from excavation to the fish themselves, hovered around $400,000. But to Bertha, it was priceless. Her mornings began with a cup of black coffee on the flagstone patio overlooking the pond. She'd watch the sun glint off the scales of the fish as they rose to greet her, their movements a slow, deliberate ballet. This was her peace, her reward. It was a self-contained paradise, governed by the laws of physics and biology she understood so well. She thought it was untouchable. She was, of course, terribly wrong. The first sign of the coming storm was a crisp, white envelope in her mailbox, bearing the officious logo of the Oakmont Homeowners Association, an organization she'd had little to do with, as her property was one of the original homesteads grandfathered in before the HOA was even formed. She had certain immunities, a fact that would soon become a major point of contention. She opened it, a mild curiosity turning to disbelief, then to a slow, burning anger. The letter was from the HOA Architectural Review Committee, a body presided over by its newly elected president, Carol Sterling. The language was a masterclass in passive-aggressive bureaucracy. It spoke of unapproved water features and auditory disturbances that violated neighborhood bylaws. Specifically, it cited the excessive and continuous noise generated by her waterfall. Bertha read it 3 times. The waterfall had been there for 7 years. It had been built with all the proper permits from the county, long before Carol Sterling had even moved into the neighborhood. The sound was a gentle cascade, barely audible from the street, deliberately designed with baffles to be a peaceful murmur, not a roar. She walked to the edge of her property, listening. The loudest sound was a lawnmower 2 blocks away. The waterfall was a whisper. This wasn't a complaint. It was a provocation. Bertha, a woman who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with city councils and stared down contractors trying to cut corners, was not easily intimidated. She pulled the original blueprints and county permits from her files, documents as thick as a small-town phone book. She highlighted the relevant sections, including the acoustical engineer's report that confirmed the decibel level was well within residential limits, even at the property line. She penned a polite, factual, and utterly firm response, citing the grandfather clause that exempted her property from most HOA aesthetic rules, and attaching copies of the permits and the sound survey. She explained that the feature was not only pre-existing but fully compliant with all county and state regulations. She sent it via certified mail, a habit from her professional life. You always create a paper trail. For a week, there was silence. Bertha allowed herself to think that was the end of it. A simple misunderstanding. A new HOA president flexing her muscles and picking the wrong target. She went back to her coffee, her fish, and her peace. Then the second letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. It claimed her exempt status was under review by the HOA's legal counsel. It also included a new, utterly baffling complaint. The color of the rocks in her waterfall was not in harmony with the community's approved natural color palette. They were local granite. They were, by definition, the natural color of the area. It was at this point Bertha realized this had nothing to do with noise or rocks. This was about power. Carol Sterling was testing her, looking for a weakness. Bertha decided it was time to learn more about her new adversary. She started with a walk. Her neighbor to the east was a kind elderly man named Mr. Henderson, a retired history professor who had lived in his house for 40 years. He was often out in his garden, tending to his prize-winning roses. Bertha found him there, carefully snipping away dead leaves. After some pleasantries about the weather and the upcoming rose show, Bertha casually mentioned the letters from the HOA. Mr. Henderson's face clouded over. He set down his shears and looked around, as if worried they might be overheard, even in his own sprawling yard. "Ah, yes, our new queen, Carol," he said, his voice laced with a weary sarcasm. "Be careful with that one, Bertha. She's a barracuda in a pantsuit." He went on to explain that Carol and her husband, a flashy real estate developer, had moved in 2 years ago. She had immediately launched a campaign for HOA president, promising to protect property values and enforce standards. What that meant in practice, Mr. Henderson explained, was a reign of terror over trivial matters. He told her about the young couple with 2 kids who were fined $500 because their children's plastic slide was visible from the street for 2 hours after a birthday party. He told her about the widow on a fixed income who received threatening letters about the paint on her trim peeling, a repair she couldn't afford. Carol's method was always the same. A vaguely worded initial notice, followed by escalating fines and threats of legal action. Most people, intimidated and unwilling to pay for a lawyer, simply complied or paid the fines. "She feeds on control," Mr. Henderson concluded, shaking his head. "She bought the most expensive house on the block, and she thinks that makes her the lord of the manor. Your property, the fact that it's large and not under her thumb, it drives her crazy. It's a challenge to her authority." Bertha listened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. This wasn't a simple bureaucrat, this was a predator. Mr. Henderson's words were a warning, but they also solidified her resolve. She wasn't a young couple or a vulnerable widow. She had resources, knowledge, and a stubborn streak a mile wide. If Carol Sterling wanted a war over the color of rocks, Bertha would bring an army of geological surveys and legal precedents. She thanked Mr. Henderson for his insight. As she walked back to her house, the gentle sound of her waterfall seemed less like a peaceful murmur and more like a battle cry. She was going to need an ally, a professional one. She picked up her phone and dialed her nephew, David. David was her late sister's son, a sharp, hungry young lawyer who had just made partner at a respectable firm downtown. He specialized in contract and property law. When Bertha explained the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Aunt Bertha, you've stumbled into the lion's den. HOA disputes can be nastier than corporate litigation." But there was a thrill in his voice. He loved a good fight, especially on behalf of his family. He listened patiently as Bertha detailed the letters, her grandfathered status, and the conversation with Mr. Henderson. "Okay," he said, the sound of keyboard clacking in the background. "First thing, from now on, you don't communicate with her directly. Everything goes through me. We'll draft a formal cease and desist. We'll state, in no uncertain terms, that your property is exempt, that her claims are baseless and constitute harassment, and that any further contact should be directed to my office." He continued. "Second, document everything. and I mean everything. Keep a log of every letter, every interaction. If she drives by your house slowly, write it down. If she glares at you at the grocery store, write it down. Time, date. What was said or done. It sounds paranoid, but in a harassment case, a pattern is everything. This was a language Bertha understood. Data, evidence, building a case. It was like preparing for a difficult zoning board meeting. Over the next few weeks, things escalated exactly as David had predicted. Carol, incensed that her letters were now being answered by a law firm, moved on to a new tactic. She began to personally patrol the sidewalk bordering Bertha's property. Bertha would be sipping her morning coffee and see Carol's luxury SUV cruise by, slowing to a crawl as it passed her house. Then, Carol started walking the perimeter on foot, a clipboard in hand, making a great show of taking notes. It was pure intimidation. The HOA sent a new notice, this time about the height of a Japanese maple near the fence line, a tree that had been there for 20 years. David's response was swift and brutal, citing county ordinances that protected mature trees and again reminding the HOA of his client's exempt status and the ongoing harassment. The situation settled into a tense, cold war. Carol's patrols continued, her glares becoming more pronounced. Bertha, on David's advice, installed a high-end security system with multiple cameras covering the perimeter of her property. Just in case, David had said. People like this. When they're cornered and their usual tactics don't work, they can become unpredictable. Bertha felt the truth of that in her bones. The peace she had cherished was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety. She found herself watching the camera feeds, her morning coffee ritual now a surveillance operation. The joy was being systematically drained from her sanctuary. She was angry, but more than that, she was determined. Carol Sterling had started this fight, but Bertha would be the one to finish it. She just had no idea how devastating the next battle would be. The attack came on a Sunday night. Bertha had spent the day doing what she loved, tending to the delicate balance of her pond's ecosystem. She checked the water chemistry, trimmed the lily pads, and hand-fed her favorite koi. Watching their jewel-toned bodies glide through the clear water, everything was perfect. The system was stable, the fish were healthy and vibrant. She went to bed with the gentle sound of the waterfall lulling her to sleep, a sound that Carol had tried and failed to silence. The next morning, the sound was the first thing she noticed, or rather, the lack of it. The silence was jarring, wrong. The constant, gentle rush of the waterfall was gone. A spike of pure adrenaline shot through her. She threw on a robe and ran to the patio door. The sight that greeted her would be seared into her memory forever. The water, normally so clear she could count the pebbles on the bottom, was a murky, sickly, green-brown. A thick, foul-smelling foam clung to the edges of the pond and the rocks of the silent waterfall. And floating on the surface, everywhere, were the still, pale bodies of her beloved fish. Akiko, Kintaro, dozens of them, lifeless, motionless, a graveyard of shimmering color. A strangled sob escaped her lips. It was a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. She stumbled out onto the patio, the acrid, chemical smell burning her nostrils. It wasn't algae. It wasn't a system failure. This was poison. Her mind, trained to diagnose complex system failures, immediately shut down the emotional floodgates and kicked into analytical mode. The main circulation pump had an automatic shutoff that triggered if the water's viscosity or chemical balance changed too drastically. That's why the waterfall was silent. It was a safety feature designed to prevent a contaminated pump from burning out, a feature she had designed. It had saved the equipment, but it was too late for the life it was meant to sustain. She felt a wave of nausea, a mix of grief and white-hot rage. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of the pond, looking for a container, a footprint, anything. Then she looked up, her gaze drawn inexorably toward the manicured lawn of the house next door. Carol Sterling's house. There was no proof, not yet. But in her gut, Bertha knew. This was Carol's answer to the lawyers and the regulations. This was her response to being defied. This was an act of war. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a crime," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Vandalism. And the destruction of private property. A great deal of it. Vandalism." The arrival of the police was a blur of flashing lights and methodical questions. Two officers, a younger man and a more seasoned woman, walked the perimeter of the pond, their faces grim. Bertha, wrapped in a blanket on her patio, gave her statement. She told them about the HOA, about Carol Sterling, about the letters, the harassment, the surveillance. She laid out the entire history of the conflict, her voice low and controlled, betraying none of the volcanic fury and grief churning inside her. The senior officer, a Sergeant Miller, listened intently, taking notes. "Ma'am, I understand why you suspect your neighbor," she said, her tone professional but sympathetic. "But right now, all we have is suspicion. There are no witnesses, no direct evidence pointing to her. Unless we can find something that ties her to this, it's going to be very difficult to press charges." Bertha understood. She had spent a career dealing with facts and evidence. A gut feeling, no matter how certain, was not proof. "I understand, Sergeant," she said, "but I'm not just going to let this go." After the police left, promising to file a report and have a talk with Carol, Bertha called David. He was at her house within the hour, his face a mask of cold fury when he saw the devastation. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Aunt Bertha, I am so sorry." "Don't be sorry, David. Be angry," she replied, her gaze fixed on the dead fish. "Get a private investigator, the best one you can find. I want to know everything about Carol Sterling, her finances, her business dealings, her personal life, everything." But Bertha wasn't just going to wait for a PI to dig up dirt. She was an engineer. She solved problems. This was the biggest, ugliest problem of her life, and she would solve it with the skills she had honed over a lifetime. She put on a pair of rubber boots and gloves. Her first priority was to collect evidence. She took multiple water samples from different areas of the pond, carefully sealing them in sterile containers and labeling them with the date, time, and location. She took soil samples from the edge of the pond, particularly from the area closest to Carol's property line. Then her engineer's brain took over completely. How would someone have done this? The poison was fast-acting and potent. To contaminate over 100 gallons of water so quickly would require a significant quantity of a powerful agent. It couldn't have just been poured in one spot. The pond's circulation system would have diluted it too slowly. It had to be introduced in a way that would ensure rapid, widespread distribution. She walked to the pump house, a small structure cleverly disguised by landscaping. Inside, the heart of the pond's life support system was silent, and there, she found it. The primary intake for the filtration system was a large, submerged pipe at the deepest part of the pond, but there was also a secondary, surface-level skimmer system with its own intake, designed to pull leaves and floating debris from the water. This intake was located at the far end of the pond, tucked away behind the waterfall, not 10 feet from Carol's property line, and obscured from the view of Bertha's house by a dense cluster of ornamental grasses. The cover of the skimmer box was slightly ajar. Kneeling down, Bertha could see scratches on the heavy-duty plastic, as if someone had pried it open with a tool. This was the point of entry. The poison had been poured directly into the skimmer intake, from where it would be sucked immediately into the main circulation pump and distributed throughout the entire pond in a matter of minutes. It was a viciously efficient delivery method, and it was a method that only someone who had carefully observed the pond's operation would understand. Someone who, for instance, had spent weeks patrolling the perimeter, studying its every feature. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when she reviewed the security camera footage. The camera covering that side of the property was motion-activated. She rewound the footage to the previous night. At 2:13 a.m., the camera activated. The angle wasn't perfect. It was aimed at the fence line, not directly at the skimmer. A figure, shrouded in a dark, hooded sweatshirt and gloves, could be seen climbing over the low section of the decorative fence, separating the two properties. The figure carried a large, heavy-looking container. They moved quickly into the shadows of the ornamental grasses, into the blind spot near the skimmer. A few minutes later, the figure reappeared, empty-handed, and scurried back over the fence. The person's face was obscured by the hood, but their build, their gait, it was unmistakably a woman. It was unmistakably Carol. Bertha saved the footage to a secure drive. She now had the how, the when, and a video of the perpetrator. It still wasn't a smoking gun, the face wasn't visible, but it was a very, very strong piece of circumstantial evidence. She called Sergeant Miller and told her what she'd found. The police returned, collected the skimmer box cover for fingerprinting, and took a copy of the security footage. They were now treating it as a criminal investigation, a felony case of property destruction given the value of the fish. Bertha felt a grim satisfaction. But it was hollow. The evidence was crucial, but it wouldn't bring her fish back. Justice was one thing, vengeance was another. And as she looked over the ruin of her beautiful pond, she knew that a simple criminal conviction wouldn't be enough. Carol Sterling had attacked the heart of her life, the legacy she had built with her husband. Bertha decided she would, in turn, dismantle Carol's. While the police built their criminal case, Bertha and David began to build theirs. The private investigator David hired, a former police detective named Frank, was worth every penny. He was methodical, discreet, and incredibly thorough. His first report, delivered a week later, was a bombshell. Carol Sterling was not the wealthy, successful businesswoman she pretended to be. Her husband's real estate development company was leveraged to the hilt, teetering on the brink of insolvency. They maintained the illusion of wealth through a mountain of debt. But the real discovery was in the HOA's finances. For the past 2 years, since Carol had become president, the HOA's books were a mess of creative accounting. Large payments were made to shell corporations for services like landscape consulting and community management. Companies that Frank the PI quickly traced back to Carol's husband. She was embezzling. She was systematically looting the HOA's reserve funds to prop up her lavish lifestyle. The fines she so zealously levied against residents weren't about maintaining standards. They were about generating cash flow to cover her tracks. "This is a classic fraud scheme," David explained, his eyes wide as he read the report. "She's running a racket. The harassment, the fines, it's all part of it. She creates problems, then fines people, and the money disappears into her pockets." This changed everything. The poisoning of the pond was no longer just a spiteful act of a petty tyrant. It was the desperate act of a cornered criminal. Bertha had challenged her authority, not just her ego. By hiring a lawyer, Bertha had threatened to bring legal scrutiny to the HOA. And Carol knew that any real investigation would expose her entire fraudulent enterprise. She had tried to intimidate Bertha into backing down, and when that failed, she had lashed out, trying to inflict a wound so deep that Bertha would be too broken to fight back. It was a profound miscalculation. The attack didn't break Bertha. It forged her grief and anger into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. It turned her into an instrument of pure, methodical retribution. Armed with the PI's report, David reached out to other residents of Oakmont. He started with Mr. Henderson, who, upon hearing about the pond and seeing the financial evidence, was no longer fearful. His indignation overrode his caution. He provided David with a list of other neighbors who had been targeted by Carol. David and Bertha held a quiet meeting in Bertha's living room. One by one, the neighbors shared their stories. The young couple with the playground slide. The widow with the peeling paint. A man who was fined for his garbage cans being visible for an hour too long. Another who was forced to tear out a new, expensive flower bed because some of the plants weren't on the HOA's approved list. Separately, their stories were annoyances, injustices they felt powerless to fight. Together, they formed an undeniable pattern of abuse and extortion. They were the rallied community, a chorus of the wronged, and they were ready to fight back. David began preparing a massive class-action lawsuit against Carol Sterling and the HOA board for fraud, harassment, and racketeering. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but Bertha's plans moved with the speed and precision of an engineering project. While David marshaled the legal forces, Bertha focused on the evidence of the poisoning. The water and soil samples she had collected came back from the lab. The report identified the poison as a highly concentrated, commercial-grade herbicide, a type not readily available to the public. It was a restricted-use chemical, primarily for clearing large tracts of land or killing invasive aquatic weeds. It required a license to purchase. This was a critical piece of information. Sergeant Miller, armed with this new data, was able to get a warrant to search Carol's property and financial records. The search of her garage turned up an empty container of the exact same herbicide, hidden under a pile of old tarps. When they checked her credit card statements, they found a purchase from a specialty agricultural supplier a month prior. Carol, in her arrogance, had bought the poison herself, using her husband's company account, thinking no one would ever be able to trace it. The police now had a direct chain of evidence: the motive of the ongoing harassment, the security footage of her on the property, the poison container in her garage, and the financial transaction linking her to it. The district attorney's office began preparing a criminal indictment. The net was closing around Carol Sterling. But Bertha knew there was one more piece to her own, more personal plan for justice. The P.I. Reports continued to flow in. Frank had discovered that Carol's financial situation was even more desperate than they'd imagined. Her husband's latest development project had stalled, a victim of over-leveraging and a downturn in the market. They were facing foreclosure on their own home, the McMansion that was the seat of her suburban empire. Her only hope was to secure a massive, last-ditch business loan to keep the whole house of cards from collapsing. The report listed the 3 banks she had applied to. 2 were large, national chains. The third was a smaller local institution, Northwood Regional Bank. Bertha's heart skipped a beat when she read the name. Northwood Regional was the bank she and Frank had helped found 30 years ago. They had poured their life savings into it, believing in the power of a community bank to serve local people and businesses. Frank had served on the board until his death. Bertha had since taken his seat. She was not just a board member, she was one of its largest individual shareholders. Carol Sterling, in her desperation, was about to walk into the lion's den, completely unaware that the lioness owned the place. An idea began to form in Bertha's mind, a plan for a final confrontation that was so perfectly, poetically just. It felt like it was written in the stars. She called the bank's president, a man she had known for decades. "George," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I need a favor. There's a loan application from a Carol Sterling. I want to handle the final review meeting myself." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. George knew Bertha well. He knew she rarely, if ever, involved herself in the day-to-day operations of the bank. For her to make such a request, something significant must be afoot. "Bertha, is everything all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. "Everything is about to be, George," she replied. "Just make sure the meeting is in the main boardroom. And have a notary and a bank security officer standing by outside." She didn't need to explain further. George trusted her judgment implicitly. The meeting was set for the following Friday. For the next week, Bertha and David worked tirelessly, preparing. David finalized the class action lawsuit, complete with sworn affidavits from a dozen families. The district attorney's office informed him that they would be unsealing the indictment against Carol on Friday afternoon for felony destruction of property, aggravated animal cruelty, and multiple counts of felony fraud and embezzlement related to the HOA. They agreed to coordinate their timing with Bertha's meeting. Bertha, for her part, assembled her own dossier. It was a thick manila folder, a weapon disguised as office supplies. Inside, she placed an 8x10 glossy photograph of her ruined pond. Behind that, a copy of the lab report identifying the herbicide. Then, a series of still images printed from the security footage, showing the hooded figure on her property. She added the P.I.'s full report on Carol's and the HOA's finances, complete with flowcharts showing how the money was siphoned off. Finally, she included a summary of the impending class action lawsuit and a pre-printed notice from the district attorney's office about the criminal indictment. The night before the meeting, Bertha couldn't sleep. She walked out to her patio and looked at the dead, empty pond. The cleanup crews had removed the fish and drained the toxic water, leaving a vast concrete-lined wound in her backyard. The silence was deafening. It was a monument to Carol's hatefulness. But tomorrow, It would become a symbol of her downfall. Bertha thought of her husband, Frank. He had been a man of quiet strength, a believer in fairness and integrity. He would have been heartbroken by the destruction, but he would have been proud of her for fighting back. This wasn't just for her anymore. It was for Frank. It was for Mr. Henderson and the young couple and the widow. It was for every person Carol had bullied and belittled. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be a retired engineer or a grieving pet owner. She would be an agent of karma, and karma, she reflected, was about to make a very significant withdrawal from Carol Sterling's account. The boardroom at Northwood Regional Bank was designed to impress. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a long, polished mahogany table that could seat 20. Bertha sat at the head of the table, a position she had occupied for countless board meetings. She felt completely at home. When Carol Sterling was shown in by a secretary, she paused at the door, a flicker of surprise on her face. She had clearly been expecting a mid-level loan officer in a cubicle, not a private meeting in the executive suite with a woman who looked vaguely familiar. Bertha recognized the look in Carol's eyes. She was trying to place her. A neighbor? Someone from the grocery store? Bertha's face, etched with grief and stress for the past month, was not the face of the serene retiree Carol had occasionally seen from a distance. To Carol, Bertha was just another obstacle, a faceless problem she had solved. "Mrs. Sterling," Bertha said, her voice neutral, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming in. I'm Bertha Ronson. I'm handling the final review of your loan application." The name didn't seem to register. Carol's confidence returned in a rush. She was in her element now. A negotiation. A pitch. She sat down, placing a leather portfolio on the table, and launched into her well-rehearsed speech. She spoke of market opportunities, of projected growth, of her husband's vision for the stalled development project. She painted a picture of success and prosperity, a thin veneer of confidence over a foundation of pure desperation. Bertha let her talk for a full 10 minutes. She listened impassively, her hands folded on the table, her eyes never leaving Carol's. She watched the arrogance, the practiced smiles, the complete and utter lack of awareness. It was like watching a documentary about a predator that had no idea it was walking into a hunter's trap. When Carol finally finished her pitch, she leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smile on her face. "So, as you can see, this loan isn't just an investment in a project, it's an investment in the future of the Oakmont community." The irony of that statement was so thick, Bertha could have choked on it. "Your financials are ambitious," Bertha said, her voice still quiet. "But before we discuss the loan, there are a few outstanding liabilities we need to address." Carol's smile tightened. "Liabilities? My credit is impeccable. Our assets are substantial." "I'm not talking about financial liabilities, Mrs. Sterling," Bertha said. It was time. With a slow, deliberate movement, she pushed the manila folder across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. "I'm talking about moral ones." Quote. Carol looked at the folder, then back at Bertha, her brow furrowed in annoyance. This was not part of the script. This strange, severe woman was deviating from the pleasantries of banking. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, her voice taking on a frosty edge. "Open it," Bertha commanded. Her voice was no longer neutral. It was cold, hard, and carried the full weight of her righteous fury. Carol hesitated. Then, with an irritated sigh, she flipped open the cover. The first thing she saw was the photograph of the dead koi. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, finally, truly seeing the woman across the table. She knew. "You," she whispered, the single word a breath of panicked air. "Me," Bertha confirmed. She watched as Carol's trembling hands fumbled with the picture, revealing the lab report underneath it. The scientific name of the herbicide, then the stills from the security camera, the hooded figure, the container. Carol's carefully constructed composure crumbled. The mask of the powerful HOA president, the savvy businesswoman. It dissolved into the face of a common criminal caught red-handed. She started to stammer, to bluster. This This is insane. This is harassment. I don't know what this is. Bertha simply raised a hand, silencing her. Let me be clear about what this is, Carol. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. This is a photograph of over $400,000 in property I will be suing you for in civil court. This is the lab report that the district attorney is using in his criminal indictment against you for felony property destruction and animal cruelty. This, she said, tapping the security photos, is you, on my property, at 2 a.m, committing the act. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing, her voice relentless. And this, she said, gesturing to the rest of the file, is a forensic audit of the Oakmont HOA's finances, detailing 2 years of embezzlement and fraud. It's the primary evidence in a class action lawsuit being filed against you on behalf of 12 of your neighbors. And finally, she paused for effect. This is a copy of the warrant for your arrest, which is being served as we speak. Carol was hyperventilating now, her face pale and clammy. She looked wildly at the door, as if contemplating escape. You can't do this, she gasped. Who are you? Bertha allowed herself a small, grim smile. I'm the woman whose pond you poisoned, she said. And I'm also a founding partner and a 30% shareholder in this bank. Your loan, Mrs. Sterling, is denied. As if on cue, there was a firm knock on the boardroom door. Bertha called, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Sergeant Miller and another officer, along with the bank's head of security. Sergeant Miller looked past Bertha and fixed her gaze on the gasping cornered woman. "Carol Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You are under arrest." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Carol Sterling, the petty tyrant of Oakmont, did not go quietly. She tried to bluster and threaten, but her power was gone. The sight of her being led out of the prestigious bank in handcuffs was a moment of profound, almost biblical justice for Bertha. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It was the talk of every block party and dog walk for months. Carol's husband, facing his own set of fraud charges and the collapse of his business, filed for divorce and sold their house at a loss to cover legal fees. He fled the state, leaving Carol to face the consequences alone. The legal proceedings were a formality. Faced with the mountain of evidence Bertha and the police had compiled, Carol's lawyer advised her to take a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to felony destruction of property and a litany of fraud charges. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to Bertha and the HOA. The civil suit was settled quickly, with the court awarding Bertha the full value of the pond and the fish, a judgment that ensured Carol would be financially ruined for the rest of her life. With Carol gone, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. An emergency election was held, and a new board was voted in, led by none other than Mr. Henderson. The old, draconian rules were rewritten. The culture of intimidation was replaced with one of community and cooperation. The funds Carol had embezzled were eventually recovered through the sale of her assets, and the HOA's finances were put back in order. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The reign of terror was over. For Bertha, the victory was bittersweet. The legal and financial justice was satisfying, but it couldn't erase the scar of the event. For months, the empty pond was a source of pain, a constant reminder of the violation. But Bertha was a builder, not a victim. She had built a career, a life, and she would rebuild this. Slowly, methodically, she began the process of restoration. She hired a specialized crew to professionally clean and sterilize the entire pond system. She upgraded the filtration and security, adding more cameras and alarms. It was a long, expensive process, but it was a necessary one. It wasn't just about rebuilding a pond, it was about reclaiming her peace. Months turned into a year. The pond was finally ready. The water was clear. The waterfall once again sang its gentle song, and the delicate balance of the ecosystem was restored. On a bright spring morning, a truck from a specialty koi breeder in California pulled into Bertha's driveway. The entire neighborhood seemed to turn out for the event. Mr. Henderson was there, along with the young couple and their kids, the widow whose house trim was now freshly painted, thanks to a new community assistance fund and a dozen other familiar faces. They were not just neighbors. They were a community forged in the fire of a shared struggle. They watched as, one by one, beautiful new koi were gently released into the pristine water. A magnificent Jinrin chagoi, its scales sparkling like diamonds. A striking shusui, with a perfect line of dark blue scales down its back. They were not replacements for Kintaro and Akiko, but they were a new beginning. As the last fish swam into the depths, the neighbors broke into spontaneous applause. Bertha stood on her patio, a genuine, untroubled smile on her face for the first time in a long while. She was surrounded by friends. Her sanctuary was alive again. It was no longer just her and Frank's legacy. It was now a symbol of the entire community's resilience. The pond, which had been the target of so much malice, had become the very thing that brought them all together. Later that evening, as the sun set, Bertha sat by the water's edge, sipping a cup of tea instead of her usual coffee. She watched the new fish explore their home, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dark memories of the past. The journey had been harrowing. It had taken her from contentment to a place of deep grief and righteous fury. But she had navigated it with determination, using her mind, her resources, and her unyielding spirit. She had faced down a bully and, in doing so, had not only achieved justice for herself, but had liberated an entire community. The sound of the waterfall was sweeter than it had ever been. It was the sound of peace, of resilience, of victory. Bertha had her sanctuary back, stronger and more meaningful than before, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that no one would ever dare to threaten it again. The blue-collar philosopher in her mused that sometimes the deepest foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of the stubborn refusal to let darkness win. The legal battles, while successful, had left a deep impression on Bertha. She saw how easily a system like an HOA could be corrupted by one individual with a thirst for power and a lack of moral character. Carol's actions were extreme, but the underlying potential for abuse was baked into the very structure of many such organizations. With her newfound status as a local hero and the backing of a grateful community, Bertha decided to take her fight to a new level. She worked with David and a state legislator to draft what came to be known as the Homeowners' Bill of Rights. It was a piece of legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in homeowners associations across the state. The bill mandated independent third-party audits of all HOA finances every 2 years. It capped the amount an HOA could fine a resident for minor infractions and established a clear, state-run arbitration process for disputes, so homeowners wouldn't have to hire expensive lawyers to fight a $50 fine for a misplaced garbage can. It also made it a criminal offense for an HOA board member to engage in targeted harassment or retaliation against a resident. It was a tough fight. The powerful HOA lobbying groups in the state capital fought them tooth and nail, calling it government overreach. But Bertha was a formidable opponent. She testified before legislative committees, not as a polished lawyer or a slick politician, but as a retired engineer, a citizen, a victim. She told her story, simply and powerfully. She spoke of her pond, not just as a financial asset, but as a legacy of love. She laid out the clear, factual evidence of Carol's fraud and abuse. News outlets picked up the story, casting it as a classic David versus Goliath battle. The rallied community from Oakmont traveled to the capital to show their support, standing behind her during press conferences, their presence a silent testament to the truth of her words. The bill passed. It was a landmark victory for homeowners across the state. Bertha had taken her personal tragedy and transformed it into a force for positive change, protecting thousands of people she would never meet from predators like Carol Sterling. Her expertise, once used to build water systems, was now being used to build better, fairer communities. This, she felt, was a legacy Frank would have been truly proud of. Her activism didn't stop there. Bertha, in partnership with Northwood Regional Bank, established a grant program. It was called the Frank Ronson Community Beautification Fund. The fund provided money to neighborhoods, both with and without HOAs, for projects that brought people together, community gardens, new playground equipment for local parks, public art installations. The The first grant was, fittingly, awarded to the Oakmont community. They used the money to build a beautiful shared pavilion and garden space in a previously neglected common area. Mr. Henderson, now the beloved and respected HOA president, oversaw the project. Residents who had once been isolated and intimidated by Carol were now working side by side, planting flowers, building benches, and getting to know one another. The garden became the new heart of the neighborhood, a place for summer barbecues and impromptu gatherings. It was a living, breathing symbol of the new era. Bertha would often visit, not as an overseer, but as a friend. She would sit with Mr. Henderson on one of the new benches, watching the neighborhood kids play, and they would talk for hours. They rarely spoke of Carol Sterling anymore. There was no need. Her toxic legacy had been completely uprooted and replaced with something vibrant and healthy. Bertha's own life settled into a new, more engaged kind of tranquility. She still had her peaceful mornings with her coffee by the pond, but her days were now filled with purpose beyond her own property line. She reviewed grant applications, mentored other community activists, and served as an informal advisor to the new HOA board. She had discovered that her skills in managing complex systems were just as applicable to people and communities as they were to pipes and pumps. She had found a new calling in her retirement, one born from crisis but sustained by a deep-seated belief in justice and the power of a united community. The irony was not lost on her. Carol, in her quest for absolute control, had ended up losing everything. Bertha, in her fight to protect her private sanctuary, had ended up strengthening an entire community and beyond. It was a perfect, karmic balancing of the scales. The ripples from that one act of malicious poisoning had spread out, not in waves of destruction, but in ever-widening circles of positive change. One afternoon, about 2 years after Carol's arrest, Bertha received a letter with a return address from a state correctional facility. Her first instinct was to throw it in the fire. What could Carol Sterling possibly have to say that she would want to hear? An apology? A threat? A plea for pity? Curiosity, however, got the better of her. She opened the letter. It was written on thin prison-issue paper, the handwriting cramped and angry. It was not an apology. It was a rambling, self-pitying screed. Carol blamed everyone but herself. She blamed her husband for his bad business deals. She blamed the neighbors for being jealous of her success. She blamed the legal system for being unfair. And most of all, she blamed Bertha. "You ruined my life over some stupid fish," one line read. "You think you're so righteous, but you are a vindictive, cruel woman. I hope you are miserable." Bertha read the letter, and instead of anger, she felt a profound sense of pity. Carol was trapped, not just in a physical prison, but in a mental one of her own making. She was incapable of seeing her own faults, incapable of empathy, incapable of growth. She would serve her time and likely emerge the same bitter, entitled person she had always been. Bertha walked out to her pond, the letter still in her hand. The water was shimmering, the fish were thriving, and the sound of the waterfall was a peaceful mantra. She looked at the life and beauty all around her, a world she had fought to protect and rebuild. She thought about her friends in the neighborhood, about the new state law protecting homeowners, about the community gardens being built with her husband's fund. She looked at Carol's letter, filled with poison and hate, and then at the vibrant world she now inhabited. She hadn't been ruined. She had been forged. Without another thought, she tore the letter into small pieces and let the wind carry them away, like dead leaves, to be forgotten. Carol Sterling was a ghost, a bad memory. Bertha was alive, and she had work to do. Her misery was the furthest thing from the truth. In the end, after all the drama and struggle, Bertha Ronson was, once again, content. The story of Bertha and Carol became something of a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be victims. It served as an inspiration. Other neighborhoods, hearing of Oakmont's transformation, began to re-examine their own HOAs. People who had previously been apathetic started attending board meetings. They questioned budgets, demanded transparency, and voted out long-entrenched, complacent board members. A ripple effect of civic engagement spread through the suburbs, all originating from one woman's fight for her koi pond. Bertha occasionally received letters and emails from people across the state, and sometimes from other parts of the country, who had heard her story. They were people embroiled in their own battles with petty tyrants, feeling hopeless and overwhelmed. They asked for advice, for encouragement. Bertha made a point to answer every single one. She didn't offer legal advice that was David's job, but she offered something more valuable, her story. She told them to document everything, to build a case with facts, not just emotions. To find allies, because no one can fight these battles alone. And most importantly, she told them not to give up. The only power people like that have, she would write, is the power you give them by staying silent. Find your voice, find your allies, and fight back with the truth. The truth is a weapon they don't know how to defend against. Her nephew, David, saw his career flourish. His work on the class action suit and his involvement in the legislative push earned him a reputation as a fierce advocate for homeowners' rights. His firm established a new department dedicated specifically to HOA law, helping countless individuals navigate the complex and often predatory landscape of community governance. He always credited his Aunt Bertha as his inspiration, the toughest client he ever had, and the one who taught him that law wasn't just about contracts and statutes. It was about justice for real people. The pond itself became a place of pilgrimage for some. Garden enthusiasts, koi collectors, and even engineering students would ask for tours. Bertha, a private person by nature, was initially hesitant, but she came to see the pond not just as her private sanctuary, but as a teaching tool. She would walk them through the complex filtration system, explaining the principles of fluid dynamics. She would point out the different varieties of koi, telling them the story of how the new collection was a gift from a community united, and she would always end the tour by the waterfall, the feature that had started the whole conflict. She would explain how its sound was carefully engineered to be soothing, not disruptive. She would tell them, anything, whether it's a waterfall or a community, can be a source of conflict or a source of peace. It all depends on the intent and the integrity of the person who builds it. People left not just with an appreciation for the beauty of the pond, but with a deeper understanding of the principles Bertha lived by: meticulous planning, unwavering integrity, and the strength to stand up for what is right. It was a living classroom for engineering, for community, and for character. The empty space on her mantelpiece, where a picture of her prize-winning koi, Kintaro, once sat, was now filled with a new photo. It was a picture taken at the dedication of the new community garden. It showed Bertha, standing shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Henderson and dozens of their neighbors, all of them smiling, their hands dirty from planting new life in the soil. To Bertha, that picture was worth more than any prize-winning fish. It represented something far more valuable: a community that had found its strength, and a peace that had been truly and justly earned. The sound of the waterfall played on, a constant reminder that even after the most destructive storm, the water will find its way, and life will, and must, go on. Bertha's war was over, but her work had just begun, and the ripples of her victory continued to spread, bringing with them a tide of change and hope. Years later, Bertha sat on her patio, now a woman in her late 70s. Her movements were a little slower, but her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. Mr. Henderson had since passed away, but the community garden he helped build was flourishing, tended by a new generation of Oakmont residents. The HOA he had reformed was still a model of fairness and transparency. The homeowner's Bill of Rights was still on the books, a permanent fixture of state law. Bertha was watching her great-nephew, David's son, toss a handful of food into the koi pond. The boy, only 7 years old, laughed with delight as the huge, colorful fish swarmed the surface. He knew all their names, just as Bertha had known the names of their predecessors. A magnificent Yamabuki Ogon, a direct descendant of the same lineage as Kintaro, nudged his hand gently. The legacy continued. David, now a seasoned lawyer with graying temples, came out and sat beside her. "He loves this pond as much as you do," he said, smiling. "It's in his blood," Bertha replied softly. "Building things, caring for them. It's what our family does." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the boy and the fish, listening to the timeless sound of the waterfall. "Do you ever hear from her?" David asked quietly. Bertha knew who he meant. She shook her head. "No. I heard she was released a few years ago. Moved somewhere out of state. As far as I know, she just disappeared." Carol Sterling was no longer a monster or a villain. She had faded into complete and utter irrelevance. The ultimate fate for someone who had craved power and attention so desperately. She was a footnote in a story that was no longer about her. The story was about the community that rose from the ashes of her petty tyranny. It was about the laws that were changed because of her greed. It was about the beautiful, thriving pond that stood as a testament to her defeat. "Good," David said. "Some things are best left in the past." Bertha nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "The past is what we learn from, David. The future is what we build." And as she looked at her great-nephew, the future looked very bright indeed. The cycle of destruction had been broken, replaced by a cycle of creation, of care, of community. It was the best kind of engineering, and the most satisfying victory of all. As Bertha continued into her golden years, she became the wise elder of the community, the very role Mr. Henderson had once filled for her. New families moving into Oakmont would hear the story of the HOA war and the legendary woman who won it. They would approach her with a mixture of awe and respect. She would welcome them with a warm smile and a cup of coffee, always ready to share her hard-won wisdom. She taught them that a community wasn't just a collection of houses, but a network of people who had to actively choose to look out for one another. She emphasized the importance of participating, of showing up to meetings, of holding leadership accountable. "Apathy is the soil where tyrants grow their roots," she was fond of saying. "Stay vigilant, stay involved, and stay kind." Her home became an unofficial community center. Her technical skills were still in high demand, though for much smaller projects. She helped neighbors design better irrigation systems for their gardens, diagnose strange noises in their plumbing, and even helped a local teen build a high-powered potato cannon for a science fair project, ensuring it met all safety and aeronautical standards, of course. Each small act of help was an act of weaving the community fabric tighter. The story of her confrontation with Carol at the bank took on mythical proportions with each retelling, but Bertha always brought it back down to earth. There was nothing magical about it, she would explain. It was just about having the right information and choosing the right time and place to present it. It was a chess move, nothing more. This demystification was part of her lesson. Anyone could do what she did. It didn't take superpowers. It took patience, diligence, and the courage to see a fight through to the end. It was an empowering message, and it resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. She was teaching them to be their own heroes, to be their own Berthas. Her relationship with the local police department also evolved. Sergeant Miller, now Captain Miller, would often stop by for coffee when she was in the neighborhood. They had forged a bond of mutual respect during the investigation. Captain Miller would sometimes bring new recruits with her, and she would have Bertha tell them the story of the pond poisoning. For the young officers, it was an invaluable lesson in the importance of taking property crime seriously and the power of meticulous, citizen-assisted police work. "Listen to people like Ms. Ronson," Captain Miller would tell them. "Sometimes the biggest cases start with a complaint that sounds small. Look for the pattern. Follow the evidence wherever it leads." Bertha, in her own way, was helping to train the next generation of law enforcement to be more empathetic and thorough. She was, in her own quiet way, still fixing complex systems, ensuring they worked better for everyone. Her legacy was not just in the laws she had helped pass or the community she had helped save. It was in the knowledge and character she instilled in those around her. It was in the ripples of her actions, which continued to spread in ways she couldn't even see. The pond was her anchor, but the community was her life's work. It was a project with no final blueprint, one that required constant maintenance, care, and attention. And Bertha Ronson, the retired civil engineer, wouldn't have had it any other way. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, a pillar of the peaceful world she had fought so hard to protect. The final chapter of Carol Sterling's story, as far as Bertha was concerned, came not in the form of a letter, but a small, unremarkable news clipping a friend sent her. It was from a local paper in a drab industrial town 3 states away. The article described a woman, using a different last name, who had been charged with check fraud and embezzlement from her job as a bookkeeper at a small manufacturing plant. The amount was modest, only a few $1,000s. It was the work of a petty, desperate criminal. The grainy mugshot accompanying the article was unmistakable. It was Carol. Older, haggard, the lines of bitterness and defeat carved deep into her face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation. Bertha read the small article and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no pity. It was like reading about a stranger. The woman in that picture had no more power over her. She was just a sad, broken person, destined to repeat her mistakes on an ever smaller stage, her world shrinking with every bad decision. Bertha folded the clipping and threw it away. Carol's fate was her own to bear. Bertha, meanwhile, had a community barbecue to attend. She had promised to bring her famous potato salad. As she stirred the ingredients in her kitchen, the sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the surface of her pond. The sound of children's laughter drifted over the fence from the community garden. This was her world, a world of life, of friendship, of peace. It was a world Carol could never touch again. The contrast was stark and absolute. It was the final, unspoken victory. One woman had descended into a self-made prison of resentment and crime, while the other had built a paradise, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. The scales of justice, Bertha mused, had not just been balanced. They had been tipped overwhelmingly in favor of the good, and that was a foundation solid enough to build anything upon. The legend of Bertha's Pond began to attract a different kind of attention. A young independent filmmaker heard the story and became fascinated by its themes of justice, community, and the quiet heroism of an ordinary person. She approached Bertha about making a documentary. At first, Bertha refused. She had no interest in the limelight. But the filmmaker was persistent and persuasive. She argued that the story wasn't just about a local dispute. It was a universal fable for modern times. It could inspire people far beyond Oakmont. Bertha, thinking of the letters she received from people fighting their own battles, finally relented on one condition. The documentary had to be about the community, not just about her. It had to feature Mr. Henderson's wisdom, the courage of the other neighbors who spoke up, and the tireless work of her nephew David. She wanted it to be a tribute to the power of collective action. The film crew spent a summer in Oakmont, interviewing the residents, capturing the beauty of the restored pond, and documenting the vibrant community life that had blossomed. The resulting film, titled The Ripple Effect, was a quiet, powerful success on the festival circuit. It won awards for its storytelling and its inspirational message. Bertha, who reluctantly attended the premiere, found herself an unlikely celebrity, but she handled it with her typical no-nonsense grace. During a Q&A after a screening, a young woman stood up and asked, "After everything you went through, was it worth it?" Bertha didn't hesitate. "Justice is always worth it," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Protecting your home, your family, and your peace of mind is always worth it. But the most worthwhile thing was discovering that my community was full of decent, brave people who just needed a reason to stand together. The pond is beautiful, but the community we built, that's the real prize." The answer was met with a standing ovation. Bertha had once again taken her story and turned it into a lesson for everyone. The film ensured that the ripples of her stand against a petty tyrant would continue to spread, carrying a message of hope and resilience far and wide. As the years passed, Bertha made sure to prepare for the future. She worked with David to put her estate in order. The house and the land were, of course, left to her family, but she made a special provision for the pond. She established a trust, funded by a portion of her considerable savings, to ensure the perpetual care and maintenance of the pond and its surrounding gardens. The trust was to be administered by a board composed of David, the current president of the Oakmont HOA, and a rotating seat for a resident of the neighborhood. The pond was to be forever designated as a semi-public space, a place where the community could come to find peace and reflect. It was her final gift to the neighborhood she loved. She was ensuring that the sanctuary she fought so hard for would continue to be a source of tranquility and inspiration for generations to come. It would outlive her, outlive all of them. A permanent monument to what they had built together. Her work as an engineer had been about creating structures that lasted. With this final act, she ensured her legacy of community and justice would be just as enduring. It was the last, perfect piece of her master plan. A blueprint for a better future. Bertha had not only won her war and rebuilt her sanctuary, but she had also guaranteed its survival, transforming a symbol of personal love and loss into an enduring public treasure. It was a final, masterful stroke from a woman who had spent her life building things that were meant to last. Bertha Ronson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89. Her memorial service was held, at her request, in the community garden she had helped fund. The entire town, it seemed, turned out to pay their respects. The governor sent a letter of condolence, acknowledging her contribution to homeowners' rights across the state. Captain Miller, now the chief of police, shared a story about Bertha's unshakable resolve. David, her nephew, spoke of her as a second mother, a mentor, and the toughest, most principled person he had ever known. But the most moving tributes came from her neighbors, the ordinary people whose lives she had touched. They spoke of her kindness, her wisdom, her quiet strength, and her potato salad. They told the story of the pond, not as a tale of revenge, but as a story of a community finding its voice, all because one woman refused to back down. After the service, people gathered by the koi pond. The fish, large and majestic, swam peacefully in the clear water. The waterfall, the source of it all, provided a gentle, constant song. It was not a place of sadness, but one of peace and remembrance. Bertha was gone, but her legacy was everywhere. It was in the fair rules of the HOA, in the thriving community garden, in the state laws protecting homeowners, and in the quiet strength of the neighbors she had inspired. And it was here, in this beautiful, tranquil pond, a sanctuary she had fought for, rebuilt, and gifted to them all. The ripples from her life continued to spread, a gentle, positive force that would be felt for many, many years to come. The blue-collar engineer had built her final and most magnificent project, a lasting legacy of justice. The narrative of Bertha's stand became a foundational myth for the Oakmont community. New residents were told the story as a way of explaining the neighborhood's unusually high level of civic engagement and its famously fair and transparent HOA. The annual community barbecue was unofficially named the Bertha Ronson Memorial Cook-Off, with a special prize for the best potato salad. The community garden erected a small, tasteful plaque near its entrance, not with Bertha's picture, but with one of her favorite sayings, "Apathy is the soil where tyrants grow their roots." It served as a constant reminder of their collective responsibility to one another. The documentary, The Ripple Effect, found a permanent home on a major streaming service, where it was discovered by new audiences each year. It became a staple in civics and ethics classes at high schools and colleges. Bertha's quiet, determined face became an unlikely symbol of grassroots activism. Law schools used the case of Oakmont residents v. Sterling as a case study in class action litigation and HOA law. The homeowners' Bill of Rights she championed was adopted, in various forms, by a dozen other states, creating a wave of reform across the country. Her single, personal fight had, in the end, helped to redefine the balance of power between individuals and the quasi-governmental entities they lived under. The pond, managed by its trust, became even more beautiful over time. The landscaping matured, the fish grew to impressive sizes, and the place became a cherished local landmark. On quiet summer evenings, it was common to see families sitting on the benches that now surrounded it, or young couples walking hand in hand along its stone paths. It was a place of peace, exactly as Bertha had intended. Her great-nephew, the little boy who had fed the fish, grew up and went to college to study, of all things, civil engineering and urban planning. He wrote his senior thesis on the role of shared public spaces in fostering community resilience, using his great-aunt's pond as his primary case study. The legacy was not just continuing, it was evolving, being studied, and being passed on to a new generation, ready to build a better world. The final, quiet echo of the saga came nearly a decade after Bertha's passing. David received a call from a public defender in another state. Carol Sterling, now in her late 70s, had died in prison, where she was serving a sentence for yet another small-time fraud conviction. She had no family who would claim her body, no assets to her name. The public defender, going through her meager belongings, had found an old, folded piece of paper in a tattered wallet. It was a photograph. A small, faded picture of a magnificent, prize-winning koi, a Yamabuki ogon. It was Kintaro. David was stunned. Why, after everything, would she keep a picture of the very creature that symbolized her downfall? Was it a reminder of her crime? A strange form of penance? Or, and this was the most chilling thought, was it a trophy? A memento of the one time she had wielded true destructive power over something beautiful? He would never know the answer. He told the public defender to proceed with the state-provided arrangements. There was nothing more to be said or done. He hung up the phone and walked over to the window of his high-rise office, looking out over the city. He thought about his aunt. He thought about the hate that had driven Carol and the integrity that had driven Bertha. He realized that Carol, in her own twisted way, had also understood the pond's value. She had recognized its power as a symbol and had tried to destroy it. But she had failed to understand that the true value wasn't in the fish themselves, but in the love and care that had gone into creating their home. You could kill a fish, but you couldn't kill the love that named it. You could poison the water, but you couldn't poison the spirit of the woman who built the pond. That was the ultimate, enduring truth. The story was, and always had been, about the builder, not the destroyer. A young couple, new to the Oakmont neighborhood, brought their daughter to see the famous koi pond. The little girl, no older than 5, peered into the water, her eyes wide with wonder at the huge, colorful fish swimming below. Her father sat down on a bench and began to tell her the story, as it had been told to him when he first moved in. "A long time ago," he began, "a very bad lady tried to hurt these fish. But a very brave woman, the woman who built this whole pond, she stood up to her. She was smart and she was strong, and she made sure the bad lady could never hurt anyone ever again." He spoke about the community that came together, about how they all helped each other. He told her how the brave woman, whose name was Bertha, had made sure the pond would be here for everyone to enjoy, forever. The little girl listened, captivated. "So, Bertha was like a superhero?" she asked. Her father smiled. "Yeah," he said, looking at the peaceful water, the waterfall singing its eternal song. "You could say that. She was a superhero." The story had passed fully into legend, a tale of good versus evil, of courage versus corruption, told to a new generation. Bertha Ronson, the retired civil engineer, the blue-collar philosopher, the reluctant warrior, had become a permanent part of the community's heart, and her legacy, like the clear, clean water in her magnificent pond, circulated endlessly, giving life to everything it touched. The ripples continued, and they would never, ever stop. The legacy Bertha left was not just one of victory, but of a changed perspective within the community. Before the conflict with Carol, the Oakmont HOA was, like many, a source of grumbling and apathy. Residents paid their dues and hoped to avoid violation notices. After Bertha, it became a source of pride. The monthly HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, were now lively forums for discussion and collaboration. People didn't just bring complaints, they brought ideas. The Bertha Ronson model, as it was informally called, was one of proactive community building. The board, following Mr. Henderson's example, saw its role not as enforcers, but as facilitators for making the neighborhood a better place to live. The HOA budget, once a mysterious document, was now transparent and debated openly. A significant portion was allocated to community events and projects proposed by the residents themselves. This shift in culture was perhaps the most profound ripple effect of all. It transformed a group of people living near each other into a true community that worked together. It proved that the structure of an HOA wasn't inherently bad. Its character was determined entirely by the people who participated in it. Bertha had not just defeated a tyrant, She had bequeathed a functioning, grassroots democracy to her neighbors. This living example of a well-run community became a model studied by urban planners and sociologists, a testament to the idea that real change often starts with one person refusing to accept the status quo. David, honoring his aunt's legacy, dedicated a significant portion of his firm's pro bono hours to a new initiative, the Bertha Project. It was a legal aid clinic specifically for homeowners across the state who were facing harassment or unjust actions from their HOAs, but couldn't afford legal representation. Young, idealistic lawyers from his firm would take on cases, armed with the precedents and strategies David had perfected during the fight against Carol. They fought battles big and small, from challenging outrageous fines to exposing fraud and self-dealing on HOA boards. The project became a powerful force for accountability, a watchdog that corrupt HOAs learned to fear. Whenever David would announce a new victory for the Bertha Project, he would privately visit his aunt's final resting place. He would tell her about the families they had helped, about the injustices they had corrected. It was his way of continuing the conversation, of reporting back to his commander. He knew she would be proud that the fight was continuing, that her name was now synonymous with justice for the little guy. The project ensured that Bertha's impact was not limited to Oakmont or the laws she helped pass, but was felt directly, one family at a time, in communities all over the state. Her battle had provided the weapons and the training for an entire army of advocates to carry on her work. The pond continued to be a place of quiet miracles. One summer, a young veteran suffering from severe PTSD moved into the neighborhood. He was withdrawn, rarely leaving his house. His wife, desperate to find something to help him, learned about the pond and its tranquil atmosphere. She began bringing him there every evening. At first, he would just sit, staring blankly at the water. Then, slowly, he began to watch the fish. He learned their patterns, their graceful movements. He found the constant, gentle sound of the waterfall soothing, a counter-rhythm to the chaos in his mind. Bertha had engineered it to be peaceful, but she could have never known the full extent of its therapeutic power. The veteran started talking to the other regulars at the pond, sharing observations about the fish. He began to open up. The pond became his sanctuary, a place where he could feel safe and calm. It was a crucial part of his healing journey. When his wife wrote a letter to the HOA board to thank them for maintaining the space, it was read aloud at a meeting, a poignant reminder of the unseen, immeasurable value of what Bertha had created. It wasn't just a collection of fish and water, it was a place of healing. It was a testament to the idea that creating something beautiful can have a positive impact on the world in ways the creator could never possibly predict. The ripples of Bertha's work continued to touch lives in deep and profound ways. In a quiet corner of a university library, a doctoral student in sociology put the finishing touches on her dissertation. The title was The Sterling Effect: How Petty Tyranny Catalyzes Community Cohesion. Her research had begun as a study of HOA disputes, but had narrowed to focus on the incredible story of the Oakmont neighborhood. She had spent months interviewing residents, David, and even retired Police Chief Miller. Her thesis argued that a common external threat, personified by Carol Sterling, had acted as a powerful catalyst, forcing a disconnected group of suburbanites to overcome their apathy and form strong social bonds. It broke down the Bertha Ronson model into an academic framework, analyzing the roles of the principal protagonist, Bertha, the wise elder, Henderson, the professional ally, David, and the rallied collective, the community. The dissertation concluded that while the tyrant's intent was to isolate and control, the ultimate, ironic outcome was the creation of a stronger, more resilient, and deeply interconnected community. It was a clinical, academic analysis of the human drama that had unfolded. When it was published, it became a respected piece of research in the field, ensuring that the story of Bertha's fight would be preserved and studied in a completely different context. The personal, emotional battle had been translated into data and theory, another way in which the legacy endured, teaching new lessons to a new audience. The story of the koi pond was now, officially, a part of academic history. One day, the 7-year-old boy, Bertha's great-nephew, now a man in his 30s and a successful civil engineer himself, brought his own young daughter to the pond. He was the spitting image of David, but with Bertha's clear, intelligent eyes. He sat with his daughter on the same bench his father had sat on with him. On the same bench his great-aunt had sat on for countless hours. The pond was as beautiful as ever, a testament to the trust that cared for it. The fish were large, serene, and seemed to recognize him. He began to tell his daughter the story. "A long, long time ago," he started, the words feeling both ancient and new. "This whole place was built by your great-great-aunt. Her name was Bertha, and she was the best engineer in the world." He told her the story of the brave woman, the bad lady, and the community that learned to be strong together. He pointed to the waterfall and explained the hydraulics in a simple way she could understand. He pointed out the different fish, calling them by the names he had given them as a boy. The little girl listened, just as he had listened, her eyes full of wonder. The story was now in its third generation, a family tale, a community legend, an academic case study, and a piece of legal history. It had become all of those things, but here, in this quiet moment between a father and a daughter, it was at its most pure. It was a story about a woman who loved her home, who stood up for what was right, and who built something beautiful that would last forever. The waterfall sang its song, the fish swam their slow, graceful ballet, and the ripples, after all these years, continued to spread.